when it comes to this AI, it's doing the work of a scientist. It seems to be very smart. It seems to have all of these mental functions. Yet we do not seem to think that this is conscious. I basically have three goals. I want to first define what I mean by consciousness, and I will try to eliminate a frequent misunderstanding that I think mars the field when it comes to consciousness. Then I will provide a little bit of history, and it will be mostly from my personal perspective about the science, particularly the neuroscience of consciousness. And I will tell you about some of the big triumphs that we had, and then some of the sad valley of tears that we might maybe have to pass through or already are in. And then before I let you go, I want to give you a positive outlook, and I will make a case that I think that while the original idea of how we might approach consciousness in neuroscience might have some issues, there are ways out. When it comes to consciousness, it's like attention in the case of William James, that we can say everybody knows what it is. We all think we know what consciousness is. We don't have to define it. But having worked on consciousness for quite a while, I realized that there's an unfortunate correlation between consciousness, or at least we think that there is a gradation of consciousness in living beings, and then something that we might call intelligence or cognition. What I really try to sum together here, I think other people struggle with as well, is mental function, things that allow us to behave and succeed in life and throughout evolution. And because it seems that, or at least we as humans, somewhat non-humbly, think that we're all the way up there, we're the most conscious, we're also the most intelligent, and we have the highest cognition. And then maybe if we put a jellyfish or an ant, if we think of these things, we put them further down, there can be a misunderstanding that often arises when people talk about consciousness, that other people think about this. So when some people talk about what I will define in a moment as consciousness, other people hear working memory or language or attention, things like this. I believe that we, thankfully, reached a point in recent human history that I can prove this wrong. So there's been many papers, especially in the philosophy department, about how these things relate. This is a paper that just came out yesterday in Nature. And it's about how ChatGPT, and I don't have to introduce this AI at this point, now gets listed on certain scientific papers. And there's a big debate because a lot, if not all people, or many, many people at least, seem to disapprove of that. Now, if that were the case that we think of cognition and consciousness to be one thing, I don't see why there's any debate. So it seems that when it comes to this AI, it's doing the work of a scientist. It seems to be very smart. It seems to have all of these mental functions. Yet we do not seem to think that this is conscious. And that is what seems to hold us back, that we attribute authorship to that. In fact, I have not seen any big march in the United States or elsewhere, or other big questions about whether Google can turn off these machines, and that we might kill a conscious being when we stop this AI. So even though there's many people that argue that consciousness and function and intelligence, these things might be tightly related, now feed to the fire, it seems that a lot of people don't hold this to be true. So I think that this right here seems to be much more the case, that we're learning that cognition, intelligence, whatever we want to call mental function, can occur in the complete absence of consciousness. And consciousness, vice versa, maybe also can occur in the complete absence of thought, behavior, all of these things. So the definition of consciousness that I favor is this. Imagine that you would be put in an isolation tank where there's warm water, and after a while you're floating in that because it has a high saline content. You don't even feel your body anymore. It's exactly the body temperature, and it's just your mind, if you will. You can also think of a deep meditative state. And all that you get is a full field stimulation of the color of red. You don't even know that it's a two-dimensional screen. It might be foggy. It could go all the way out in the distance. All that there is dominating in your consciousness is red. There's just redness. That, which could occur without any working memory attention, that is, I think, what is interesting and what a lot of people think of as consciousness. But how can this be studied? Well, when I was an undergrad, I read a book by Francis Crick, and then later another one by his collaborator, Crick Koch, and they made a compelling point they said that even though consciousness seems to be immaterial, we can study it scientifically. That at the point seemed radical, because when we think of science, we think of physics, biology, chemistry. We deal with matter, things that we can objectively observe. How can we study consciousness? Well, a lot of cognitive psychology had already paved the way. If you agree that we can study working memory or attention, these are all immaterial things, then why can we not study consciousness? And they said, in particular, what we should focus on is that there seem to be two types of neural processes happening in the brain. One is unconscious. So that is, for example, neural processes that are happening in your brain right now, and they're regulating the amount of sugar in your blood, or the temperature that your body core has. There's a lot of housekeeping that you don't even want to know about, and your brain thankfully does that without you ever being aware of it. There's other processes in your brain that you could be aware of, but you're not. So if I tell you that you can feel your clothes right now, you might feel the clothes on your skin in just a second before you didn't. So it seems that we can even move certain brain responses out of this unconscious zone into a conscious zone. And this is what's intriguing. So there's certain brain processes, when they occur, we have an experience, like feeling the clothes on our skin. And they coined these brain processes the NCC, or the neural correlates of consciousness. And the fact that there's a distinction between them, they said, allows us to do experiments and dissociate these two and then study those. The whole idea was we need to isolate these processes and then find out what makes them different from all the other processes that happen in the brain that you're unconscious of. And they had a pretty compelling proposal how to do that. They said we should use visual illusions. And so this is one of my favorite ones. If you have never seen this before, just fixate on the black cross right there in the center of the screen. If you don't look away, what's going to happen is that all of a sudden you see a green dot. And if you keep looking, you will see that the magenta dots entirely disappear from view, and you will only see a green dot. But if you blink or you look away and you look back onto the screen, you will see that there is no green dot, and the magenta screens are there the whole time, except one of them I remove at a time. So in other words, this shows that when it comes to our subjective perception of the world, in particular in vision, you miss things sometimes that are very saliently present, that are obviously stimulating your eyes, such as these magenta dots, and then you confabulate and you see things that don't exist, like the green dot that doesn't exist in the real world. So if we take this further, then what we could do is show visual illusions to subjects, and we should find two types of brain responses. We should find brain responses that correspond to what is out there in the world, or, if you will, the retinal image, what actually activates the eye. And then there should be different brain responses, and they should correlate or mimic or respond to or go hand in hand with what you actually perceive. So that was the proposal by Crick and Koch, which at the time I found really quite compelling. In fact, at that point I said, I know what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. Here I am. So the basic idea of a neurocorrelate of consciousness is that we keep the world constant, we vary consciousness. So the one variable that we change in the laboratory is consciousness, and then we see what type of neurocorrelation correlates with that. And the idea is that once we have that, we can also make the inverse inference that this type of neural activity, whenever it occurs, is causing certain conscious states. So we found a physical substrate that is causing these subjective experiences of ours. Now, this, I wasn't the only one who was intrigued by that proposal. This right here are PubMed citations, and you can see these papers were published in the early 90s, and research on a topic skyrocketed. All of these are citations that are counted on PubMed that are using the term neurocorrelates of consciousness. And most of this work, I wager, is based on a discovery that was first made in the 1500s by this gentleman, Giambattista della Porta. He was a true Renaissance man. There's 2-3 pages of Wikipedia dedicated to him, even though most of us never heard of him. He did horticulture, art, medicine, a lot of things. And because he was a very prolific person and tried to accomplish so much, one day he found out that when he tried to read 2 books at the same time, just to save time, he put one in front of his left eye and another book in front of his right eye. He couldn't do it. He could just read one book at a time. And so he wrote in his diary that he discovered that it seems that we can only read with one eye at a time. You cannot read what is in each eye separately. And so this phenomena we now know as binocular rivalry. So whenever we show very different things to the two eyes, one eye's view dominates perception. And in fact, you tend to not see at all what's in the other eye. Now, binocular rivalry has been studied extensively in this department. Of course, Randolph, Blake, Frank Tong, Jeff Woodman, Zoe Park. There's actually more people that I can put on here. Sometimes I pinch myself in the morning that I ended up in this department where Bob Fox and Randolph, actually binocular rivalry research being the center of binocular rivalry research in the world. And now I ended up here. But this is the credit I want to give, because from this point on, I will only mostly speak about my own research on the topic and give you a personal perspective, not because the other work I don't want to appreciate, just because I know my own personal perspective best. There's a variant of binocular rivalry that I used once I realized this is what I want to do. I found a lab that would do this kind of research, and I convinced them to do these experiments. And what we decided to do is we would use a variant of binocular rivalry that I'll have to walk you through here for a moment. So let's imagine there's nothing in your left eye, just a white screen, and in your right eye, I would show a red vertical grading. Well, what happens in this case is that you see a red vertical grading on a white screen. So it seems that your brain is just adding together or somehow combining what is in the left eye and the right eye. That is why I titled the talk the Cyclopean Forge. We call this the Cyclopean view. It seems that even though we have two eyes, in the end our perception mimics having only one eye. If you ask little children, where are your eyes? They often do this. They point right in the middle, and that's accurate. That is actually the perspective that your brain computes from the two eyes. Now we can do the inverse as well. So I can show a green grading, let's say in the left eye, and nothing to the right eye, and that is what you're going to see because of cyclopean perception. Well, things get more interesting if you add a temporal component to that. So let's say we put a rightward tilde grading in the right eye again. Again, that's of course what you see, and we keep it there for about a second, and now we add a second stimulus in the other eye. Now there's a green stimulus, a green grading, where there's a red stimulus in the other eye. And what happens in this case is you will, for a brief moment in time, see that new stimulus. It's almost like your brain got bored by that stimulus in the right eye. It's facing conflict. It has to make a decision. You can't see both at once. And it invariably favors the new stimulus. That's something interesting. It's new. Let's elevate that to perception. I should mention that is what we call binocular rivalry flash suppression, because we're flashing a new stimulus and it's suppressing the adapted stimulus. Now, the interesting thing is we can inverse the temporal sequence. So I can show a green stimulus to the left eye. Again, adapt for about a second or more. Now turn on the right eye stimulus, the red vertically tilted grading, and now that one is new, and that one is the one that's elevated to perception. Now, if you pay close attention, what you can see is that physically, when it comes to what's out in the world, if you forget about history for a moment, this is the exact same kind of simulation. So if I would look at what is the input to your brain, what's in your eyes, in both cases, there's a red grading in your right eye and a green grading in your left eye, but in one case you see this, in the other case you see that. So we achieved pretty much a complete separation from your consciousness and the world out there. And we can argue, again, forgetting about history for a moment, that the brain responses right here that are identical, that truthfully, veridically, report what's actually out there in the world, a red and a green grading. But if we find brain responses that are different, in this case, reliably, we might have touched on the NCC, on these brain processes that correlate with perception. That is what this original idea was, but finding a correlate or correlation between neural activity and consciousness. Now I will show you some actual data that I collected while I was a graduate student. To the left right here, you can see something that I call physical alternation. So what that means is we're alternating stimuli between the two eyes, left eye and right eye, and you can see there's a red stimulus and a green stimulus. And we're adapting, in this case, to the red stimulus, and then in the other eye, we turn a green stimulus. The reason I call this physical alternation is that there's only one stimulus present at a time. So there's a left eye stimulus, and then I turn this off, and I turn on a green stimulus. Or I do the inverse. I turn on the green stimulus first, turn it off, and then the red stimulus. And then the flash suppression I just explained to you. Now, if we look what single brain cells are doing, and of course I'm showing you a really good example right here, is that you can see in this case that this neuron seems to prefer one of these two stimuli. So in red is the first sequence, And you can see it go up and fire. And then when I turn that stimulus off and turn the stimulus on in the other eye, it stops, doesn't respond. But if I flip the stimuli and I first show the other stimulus and then turn on the other one because I alternate these two, well, now I get this response. So it's a seesaw response, as you would expect. In other words, this neuron right here truthfully reports to the brain that there is its preferred stimulus present. And it stops reporting that when I take it off the screen. Well, how does this respond when I do flash suppression, where I end up with both stimuli on the screen, but in one case, one is perceived and the other one the other. And you can see that this neuron here, quite interestingly, does something very similar to here. So it still shows the seesaw pattern, not perfectly so, and there's a lot of interesting details, but you can still see we go up and then down, or down and up. So up and down, or down and up. So your perception mimics this stimulation that I turn a stimulus on in one eye, turn it off, turn on another stimulus in the other eye. Here that's not true. Stimuli are both present, but you only perceive the stimulus or this stimulus, and that neuron seems to go hand in hand. So following the original idea by Crick and Koch, I got very excited as a graduate student. I found a neuron that has something to do with your perception. It's part of the neurocorrelate of consciousness. This happened though. Soon after the peak in the early 2000s, right around the time when I got my PhD, interest in the NCC declined. This is really interesting because typically when you show citations as a function of time, as I do here, there's a little bit of sleight of hand going on. Because all PubMed citations go up because there's just more and more research and more publications. So when citations go down, that's really drastic. So I want to give you an idea of why this might have happened. And it was that more and more papers came out, such as this one, that said there's a fundamental problem with the approach. And they argued the following. They said, okay, everything that I showed you so far works. So we can look at neurons, and when we see that activity and it correlates with a certain conscious state, that is fine, but here's a problem. There might be certain neural activity that is upstream or downstream of that activity, and it will look the same to you. So let's think about this for a moment. So for example, I ask a subject to say, whenever you see the red stimulus, tell us by pulling a lever or something. Well, now I'm not really testing the perception of that subject. I'm also asking the subject to do cognition. I'm asking to think about what's on the screen, come up with a motor response, make a decision, all of these things. And if they are exclusive for, let's say, the right-hand lever, they will always occur when I thought there's a red stimulus on the screen. So how can I dissociate this motor response, this motor planning, all of these thoughts from the actual perception? That was a real problem. There's some workarounds that people have come up with in the meantime, but it did put a dent in it. And likewise, people said there could be an inverse. There could be certain things leading up to the NCC that don't really belong to the NCC. So it would turn, you think these neurons are really important for perception, or there are correlates of consciousness, but if you look more closely, it turns out they only did so and lured you into thinking that, but if you look more closely, it turns out that's not the case. If that sounds a little bit abstract and obscure to you, I will show you that example right in a moment. Lastly, you can also think how, for example, if I see a new stimulus, invariantly that will grab my attention. So if I just said that attention is different from consciousness, how can I tell these two things apart if in these experiments they're always coupled? So people over the years came up with more and more criticisms of these experiments. And as I said, I will show you that I ran into that very criticism myself as a graduate student. So what I'm showing you right here is what I just showed you before, but I'm only showing you the latter part, only the interesting part of the neural response. So again, this is physical alternation. Only the red stimulus is present or the green stimulus is present, and you can see that neuron only responds when the red stimulus is present. But when both stimuli are present, and I do this trick of flash suppression, and the red stimulus is perceived, that neuron also responds. Again, hooray, that's an NCC neuron. Exciting. Well, what I have left out so far is that these gratings, I can, of course, change their orientation, or if they're moving, I can change their direction of motion. So I can come up with a different pair of stimuli that looks very similar, but is slightly altered. So in this case, I keep the red stimulus. That's the stimulus that this neuron really likes and indicates when it's present in its receptive field. But I change the stimulus that it doesn't care about. Well, if you look at what that causes, not much. It doesn't care about the green stimulus one way or the other. It really just cares about that red stimulus. But to my surprise, when I ran that fresh suppression thing again, now using that green stimulus that it doesn't care about, it wasn't a neurocorrelate of consciousness anymore. In this case, the firing rate collapsed, and it veridically, truthfully reports that in both these cases, stimulation is identical. So even though this stimulus didn't seem to affect that neuron's firing when I tested it in isolation, it seemed to kick it out of the neurocorrelate of consciousness. That's a problem. So how can we go on if that original idea seems to fall apart this way? Well, this is where my spiel comes in. I think the fundamental problem that we had with this approach of calling it neurocorrelates of consciousness is that typically, or very often in science, we use this word correlation to be humble. What we actually mean is causal relation. So we say, we can only measure things that correlate. I can't show you that they're actually causal. Well, that's correct. What we do mathematically, most of the time, is we show that two things correlate. But the implicit assumption is that there's a causal relationship there. So it seemed that this term, neurocorrelates of consciousness, was just a humble way of saying we're trying to find the neuroprocesses that cause consciousness or a certain conscious state. And I think that's flawed. I think that's where things already go wrong. I think they're not necessarily causing it. They are that conscious state. That neuroprocess is your perception of red. So it's not a causal relationship, it's actually an identity relationship. And what that means is that maybe we should not just stick to finding correlates, neuroprocesses that correlate with certain conscious states. But what we actually want to find is the causal relationship, or the identity relationship, if you will. So what we really want is what neural activity is the identity of that conscious state. In other words, we want to come up with a function or equations that we can put in and get an output. Equations that allow us to put in neural activity and derive conscious states. So, so the question is, can you see the color red and it comes about with totally different neural states? Right? So it's true for functions, but there's other relationships that you can come up with mathematics that allow for one-to-many mappings. Right? And so that's one interesting question. Can you have a one-to-many mapping from different neural states to the same conscious state, or vice versa? Can you have different conscious states with the same neural state, right? And so, but now we're talking mathematics. And so we moved away from, we're just looking at for correlation. My second appeal as to why we want to look for equations is that equations seem to be all there is. So that's a big statement. But if you stay with me here for a while, these are the equations I found in a book that said the most important equations in science. What they mean by that is that if we believe the scientific story that there is an absolute minimum in terms of time and space, the Planck scale, and an absolute maximum, which is the time that has passed since the Big Bang and the expansion of the universe ever since, all of these disciplines that we deal with, they usually happen somewhere around these scales. And those are the equations typically learned from physics that give rise to all of the phenomena that we're interested in. So if you're interested in sociology, really you're just interested in the psychology of a bunch of people. The psychology really just boils down to the neuroscience of their brains. That neuroscience really just boils down to the cellular biology of systems neuroscience, which boils down to organic chemistry, which boils down to quantum physics. So if we take this reductionistic approach, we end up just in math. Why we end up just in math, that's a bigger question. But it seems to hold true for the history of science as we had it since centuries that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. Now, if that's true, that we can describe all of nature, when we really boil it down in equations, why would consciousness be different? Unless you take a mystical stance and believe that consciousness somehow is outside the realm of science. So the third argument that I have here is that equations really are just notation and rigor. So what we're doing is we're getting rid of explaining what we mean in terms of words, and we're coming up with symbols that are unalterable. So we cannot really argue about Maxwell's equations as we might do about Darwin's theory of evolution. I'm willing to say maybe it's not equations, and really we should get rid of the equal sign and use dots, and we come up with relations instead. The thing is, there seems to, in the end, to be mathematical structures or objects or relations, and that is what we describe in science. You can go as extreme as people like Max Tegmark do, and they say, really, that seems to be all there is. The deeper you sink into modern physics, the more you realize that if you go to a modern physics talk, they just talk math. And that's because they come up with things where they say, well, if you look at, we plot spin versus, let's say, charge. Well, we find a particle in the upper quadrant of that plot, in the lower quadrant, and there's some missing. And then they go and find them. And so the Higgs particle, there's, some of the quarks were found this way. They were predicted purely from somebody putting math on a piece of paper. And so that to me suggests that math seems to be quite fundamental. It seems to get at something really about how nature works. Again, why this is difficult to understand. Now, if that's true, this is a recent review by Anil Seth and a colleague, and they try to collect all the different theories that people have come up with about consciousness and the neuroscience of consciousness. In fact, that's only table 1, or A, okay? So there's more of those. But my point is, which of these theories contain equations that do that we can put brain activity in and get consciousness out? Well, the answer is only one of them does. And that's integrated information theory. In fact, these are the equations of integrated information theory. And so for the remainder of the talk, I will talk a little bit about this. Now, please don't mistake this as me advocating for integrated information theory. What I'm saying here is, and so I'm going to lend some words here from a physicist who should have gotten the last Nobel Prize, but he passed away. And he found the same thing in physics, and he argued for moving away from verbal theories to mathematics. And so he, leaning on the scholastics, he said that this right here may not be true. It may also not be beautiful, but it's good. It has a certain goodness. And the goodness is that it doesn't contain words, that we can actually do calculations, put in numbers, and move from the qualitative to the quantitative. So these equations, they work for systems that are non-brain as well, which is very interesting. Yeah. If I have time at the end, I might speak to that. Okay, so this is Julius Tononi's integrated information theory. It comes with all of these equations. I will give you a little bit of a better idea what it actually means in a moment. But my appeal is that if you champion any of the other theories, please do that. Come up with mathematical notation, formalize your theory, and then we can pit these two together on a level playing ground. Okay, so what does IIT really do? So some of you have probably heard about that what you can do in IT is that you can put in data, brain data or from another system, and you can compute a single scalar, a single number, and that number is called phi. And the higher that number phi is, the more conscious that system is assumed to be. So throughout this talk, your phi is probably slowly declining. And as you go down into deep sleep, phi will be really low, and then tomorrow when you wake up and have more coffee, phi get really high. So that is what most people know about IIT, and it's interesting, and I will talk mostly about that. But IIT actually does more than that. And this is where the first time, it took me a while to understand and appreciate that. IIT really means that if you take these equations and you put in the math, what you come up with is this multidimensional structure, and that structure tells you your consciousness. So if you see the color red, as I said before, and you just perceive the color red, we should be able to derive this mathematically from this structure. And that might seem absurd to you, but in a moment, I lay you out how I think that that is not absurd at all. But IIT really does give you equations that are like mind reading. You put in brain activity, you should get out what you just perceive right now. IIT talks about consciousness as subjective experience, and perception is often defined as subjective experience. So there's a huge overlap between those two. When behaviorism was dominant, there was one psychologist, and he went under in anesthesia. They intubated him, And they gave him a muscle relaxant, so he couldn't move a single muscle in his body. And they would have a conversation, wake him back up and see if he could remember, just to show that you do not need behavior in order to have perception or consciousness or experience. Life is an interesting parallel case in that scientists for the longest time have thought that life is mysterious and not part of science, and it's immaterial, and life can only come from life. And so that idea of vitalism has died a gruesome death once the DNA double helix was discovered. Nobody believes this anymore. We can now create life. I mean, Craig Venter does that in his institute just from chemical reagents off the shelf. So in a way, consciousness still has that mystique that it seems to be unscientific and immaterial like life. But what I'm trying to get is it might just be like life that later on we look at that and we say, duh. And that it totally falls into the purview of science, just like life does. But I believe that even though for us, life seems to be a prerequisite for consciousness, there could be artificial systems, so we don't define as living, that have consciousness. This having said, I put the AI on the other axis, right? So if you use this theory, AI does not come out as conscious. Real quick rundown of IIT. And so at this point, I should say that there are workshops where people are being taught the math behind IIT, and they take about a week or two. So there's only so much I can do at this point. It's a huge theory. The latest version was just published, and it's something like 15 pages long. So I will right here only be able to give you a gist of it. The really interesting thing about IIT, and that's important, is that it starts from almost nothing. If you ask different philosophers, what are we really certain of? You probably won't get the same answer. But there might be quite a bit of overlap that a lot of people say, I think Descartes with his cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, like that was a pretty good insight. You cannot argue away that you exist right now. And in fact, that's exactly what IIT uses as its starting point. So Giulio Tononi calls it the zeroth axiom. We start by saying that experience exists. And then he says, if that's true, what can we derive? And he's coming up with 5 more features of existence. So experience exists, there is something for you. You can't deny. You can deny everything. You can think you live in the matrix, but you can't deny that you exist. It exists intrinsically, so that means it exists for itself. What that means is you do not need us to be around you for you to have conscious experience. You could be totally isolated on Mars, you would still be conscious. It's specific, so that means consciousness is what it is. It can't be something else. It's integrated. Well, one way to think about it is that you're hearing my voice, you're seeing me, and you're feeling the cold of the room. It all happens in the same theater, if you will. And it is exclusionary. So what that means is that right now you cannot see what's behind you. Certain things are excluded from your conscious perception, and it is composited in that it has structure. So for example, colors, different colors, or different levels of brightness. Now, these are called axioms, because what Giulio does here is he leans on how mathematics works. Ever since Gödel, we know that mathematics cannot prove itself. And that we got proven. So we know that mathematics cannot prove itself. And so we went all the way back to what the ancient Greeks did in the book of Euclid, where they said, well, let's start with what we can agree on. So for example, that a line is the shortest distance between 2 points. Can we agree on that? Well, if we do, we have an axiom. And then what science does, it comes up with these axioms. And then based on these axioms, we can investigate other statements. Are they true or false? And given those axioms, if they turn out to be true, well, then now we have a theorem. And so we can keep on building that whole branch of mathematics, the whole tree of mathematics, for building all of these theorems that are all proven. Now we take other proven theories to make other theorems, and it all goes bound to these axioms. And so in IIT, there's 5 of these axioms. So you will have to agree on those 5 axioms to agree on IIT. It would be, by the way, really interesting to drop one of these axioms and test the theory, something mathematicians do all the time. That's how we went to Einstein. So we found out that one of Euclid's axioms was incorrect, or that interesting things happen if we drop it or relax it, as mathematicians say. So this would be an interesting task. Now what IIT does then is maybe less controversial. It comes up with postulates. And so what are postulates? So IIT says, look, we're all of probably reasonable beings, and we believe in science, we believe there's a physical world out there, we believe in neuroscience, and if that's the case, what must be a physical system like to satisfy these axioms? And again, I don't have enough time to talk all about this, but let's talk about the first axiom, that one that consciousness exists. Well, Something exists in science only if it has causal power. So if there would be particles out there in the universe that don't interact with any other particles and any other energy, we would never know. It doesn't exist for science. The only subject of science are things that have causal power and other things, because we study the effects of those things. So that is when we say it exists, it must have causal power, okay? So you can see how we go from these axioms to, again, something we agree on, all of these postulates. So 5 axioms turn into 5 postulates, and then those turn into the math. So once you agree with these postulates, for example, when I just said that there must be causal power in what exists, well, now we can come up with math to determine causal power, and so on. Again, don't have to walk you through. A lot of this is quite ingenious. And I gave previous talk on this. I think interesting to neuroscientists, even if you're not interested in consciousness. If you're interested in causality in your neural data, there's a mathematical apparatus right here that you can use that people outside of the IIT field don't seem to be that aware of. Okay, but that's how we end up with these equations in IIT. Because these are equations, well, it's very easy to turn them into computer code. And in fact, that has been done. So you can go on GitHub, and there's a computer code package called PyPhi. And what that does is you can throw in your neural data, and it gives you phi, it gives you everything that I talked about. If you worry at this point that I'm too exuberant, I'll give you that. You will appreciate the next slide. Let me tell you that there's a lot of problems with that, okay? And so there's a lot of problems, and these are just the ones that I came up in a couple of minutes before the talk. So even though all of this is fantastic and doable, when it comes to actually running your data, there's a lot of questions that have to be answered. Some of them might not be easily answerable at all. But what I would like to do is invite you to, because I think most of them are empirical in nature, to go and tackle these questions. We should use our data, throw it into PyPhi, and see what comes out. Okay, now, does this theory have any empirical support? That might be the next question. Is it falsifiable? Yes, because people have gone after it. And what do we have in terms of support? There's a lot of papers that speak in favor, and some papers, including one that was here done at Vanderbilt, that are skeptical of IT and have the results that go against it. The important thing is, none of them do what I just said. So what all of these papers do is that they say, well, if IIT is true, then, and then they come up with a qualitative, not a quantitative prediction. They're not using IIT's math. They're just saying things, well, if you believe IIT, then your consciousness should not rely on the frontal lobe. So therefore, if I don't see consciousness in the frontal lobe, and so on. So let me give you an idea of this. So this is where the original experiments were done to test IIT. Again, they're indirect, and they were called ZAP and ZIP. So what people did is they took humans, they put a TMS device onto their skull, and they also put an EEG cap on. So they were able to record the EEG signals, and then that's the zip, and then zap it with a TMS pulse and see what happens. And they did that as humans were in different conscious states. In particular, the very first science paper that came out, they had people fall asleep. And the idea was that, well, if it's integrated information, something should happen to this pulse in particular. It should not get integrated anymore. And without going into the details, you can compute an index, the PCI index, that shows you how much integration happens. And so here you can see these EEG patterns in response to that TMS pulse, how they spread. This is the algorithm. Again, I'm not going to go into details, but in the end, you come up with this integration index, and you can see it's highest when people are awake and conscious. And during non-REM sleep, that's the sleep where we think there's no dreaming happening, it goes down. It also goes down during anesthesia, general anesthesia, where we, again, believe there's no consciousness happening. I'm not going to go into detail. This has been expanded. People have tested ketamine, for example, which is an anesthetic that does seem to cause conscious dream states. In that case, it goes back up. So far, this all seems to go with the theory, but it's indirect. Now, for me, the really game changer, the real milestone happened last year. And it was this paper by Angus Leung in Nao Tsekia's lab. And it was done in Drosophila melanogaster, the common fruit fly. So what they did is they got data from people that put linear multi-electrodes array in the mushroom body of the fruit fly, which is kind of the equivalent of a brain. And then they did all of this math on the data. And again, I don't have time to walk through all of this, unfortunately, but you can see a lot of things that are familiar to us. So this would be local field potentials from 2 channels as a function of time. And then all they did is they took the mean, and whenever the local field potentials were above the mean, they called it an up state. When it was below the mean, they called it a down state. They did it for those two electrodes. And now what you end up with is a binarized sequence of events for both of these electrodes. And that is the input to integrated information theory. Quite briefly, what you're asking is if one electrode is in an up state, and we look at the next moment in time, does that have a causal effect on whether the other electrode will be in a down state or an up state in the next moment of time? And then you walk through all of the possible computational combinations. And again, in the end, you really just use this pi-phi. And what they found is that if we look at that one scalar, phi, that shows how conscious a system is versus not, they found that these phi values right here, that normal distribution or skewed distribution, those are the phi values they found in fruit flies that are normal, regular, awake fruit flies. But when they added an anesthetic to these fruit flies, they behave like mammals do. They stop behaving, they seem to fall asleep, and that phi also goes down. So this, to me, even though it's fruit flies, was the first time when somebody used the mathematics of IIT, used it on brain data, and they found something that makes sense. Okay, well, our brains are very different. So there's a primate brain, of course, and we know that our cortex has its own interesting structure, in particular, this laminar structure that you can see in neural stains. So lots of people have had this idea that you should insert electrodes into a mammalian cortex and you should focus on these columns that give rise to these layers. You should get neural activity from these different layers and then, again, compute phi by running the pi-phi platform. I did this using data from Jake Westerberg, who's now a postdoc in Andre Basto's lab. It was published not on IIT, but the original data, the original experiment in PNAS. Recordings were done in V4. And what happened was that the animal fixated on the screen, and then there were a bunch of green circles and one that was red, and the animal had to make an eye movement to the red circle. Quite simple. But we believe that when these stimuli come on, the oddball draws attention. Okay, so this is the neural response. This is baseline. The stimulus comes on. This is literally the firing rate. And you can see in blue, when the animal attends, you get a little bit more firing than when the animal doesn't attend. That's an old hat. That's what you see in V4. But what about if you compute phi? Well, doing the baseline, when I computed phi, I found a certain phi value. Did it again just to see if we can replicate it. Still comes out pretty much the same. So that's robust. When the stimulus comes on, phi goes up. Well, there's something more happening in your consciousness, maybe draws attention. But what happens when the animal attends? Phi goes even further up. Well, attention seems to enrich consciousness. That seems to make sense. But this is an interesting case because the firing rate is high, but it's for a stimulus that might not really be fully in the animal's conscious awareness. It's an unattended stimulus. And lo and behold, phi drops even below baseline, where attention might be distributed. Well, that's only one example application of phi. This is a collaboration that's ongoing with Sean right here and Katie Chang. And so Katie, one of the really compelling things that she's doing is she's taking human fMRI data and she's trying to determine how vigilant, aroused, or wakeful people are in the scanner. Why is she doing that? Well, one reason is that if we have patients and they're comatose, we ought to know. Another one is that these changing levels in arousal in an fMRI machine are actually really bad if you're interested in what else the brain is doing. So her idea is that if we know when the subjects are more or less awake and we can take that out of the data, clean the data up from this artifact, we can go more after what we're really interested in. And so what I'm showing you right here is that blue line is EEG data that Katie in her lab has collected inside the MRI machine. And she's looking at what right now is the gold standard definition of arousal. That's it. You have gamma activity, high activity, rather than low activity. You just take the ratio of those. And you can see that this right here is a gamma-rich period, and then it drops down to an alpha or beta-rich period. And so that is usually when we get more sleepy. And you can see in this faint gray line, it's faint because it's not that important. That is what people have tried a long time ago. You just do functional connectivities, you take some voxels, you correlate it with the other voxels, you see if that tracks arousal, and it doesn't do a good job. This darker line right here is an fMRI template that Katie published in PNAS a couple of years ago, and that's a machine learning algorithm where you put in fMRI data and you tell it this is high arousal, that's low arousal, and then you see how it does. It's also not that great. But Katie, who was in a similar talk last year ago, she went back to her lab and then she ran integrated information theory on her data. And this is what she found. That same pattern. It changed right there where the EEG changed. She couldn't find that in her other fMRI data. So again, that math, that algorithm seemed to work pretty well. You see how it's cause-effect information, not phi? This goes with the problems I talked about. This is my big appeal. So when we use real-world data on this algorithm, we run into limitations. And fMRI, it's just the amount of data. So you're not very data-rich if you only take a brain scan every 2.5 seconds. And so we cannot currently compute phi because of that. So we're taking measures that lead up to phi, where it's unclear if they should go up or down. And we do see them to correlate with the wakefulness state to some degree. But the interesting case here would be, how can we deal with this? Can we work with a theoretician, with mathematicians, or experimentally, or empirically? Just try different things and see if we can interpolate phi, come up with other techniques, and see if we actually satisfy the theory. This, though, to me, is highly encouraging. If you compare this to that, this comes from assuming that Descartes is right and taking the 5 axioms and coming up with math. And despite that theory having nothing to do with fMRI data, it seems to hold. So where's all of this going? So what I've showed you so far is that I think there's limitations to that NCC approach. That might explain why that has fallen out of favor for people that are interested in the brain and consciousness. And now I'm telling you, there's something even better that maybe we should try instead. And it's better because it doesn't just start with correlation. It comes at the cost of giving up a theory-free search, which is nice. But the theory itself is worth investigating. I gave you some ideas. We could relax axioms. We could see what happens. We can play with the math. And the little bit of dabbling that my lab and other labs have done seems promising. There seems to be something in the preliminary data. But that's not why I'm really excited about this. So the last 2 slides, if you bear with me, I will tell you why I'm really excited about this. So I told you that we can compute phi as a quantity of consciousness, and that seems to somehow work. But what's really interesting is that we're also coming up with this multidimensional structure, and that is supposed to tell us something about the qualia, or the content of consciousness, not just the level. And I think this is where this really gets interesting. Because if you study perception, mathematical structures to describe the contents of your consciousness are fairly commonplace. So what I put right here is something that any psychophysicist knows in the auditory field, or if you learn music theory, which is that if you take a tone, and that could be a sine wave of, let's say, 440 hertz, and you double its frequency, so you get 880 hertz, that tone that you get has an eerily familiarity with that previous tone. We call it an octave. So if you take an entire song at one level of frequencies and you double all of the frequencies, the song just sounds like the same song, just an octave higher. And the way that this has been conceptualized geometrically is as a helix, where with each successive tone, let's say of the regular 12-tone scale, I move up in pitch. But I'm moving not straight up, I'm moving up in a helix, so that if I reach the same point where the frequency doubles, there is a relationship here, the octave relationship, when musicians call that chroma, that those 2 tones have the same chroma. So what's interesting to me is that we're having a 3-dimensional mathematical model here for content of your consciousness. That's one that people don't usually think about. If I tell you about that, most people immediately think about color space, which is another 3-dimensional space that contains your perception. There's also a phase space that people, including in this department, have discovered. There's many of these spaces that we as cognitive psychologists have derived with to explain mathematically the contents of our consciousness. Well, phi is also giving you a structure, a geometric structure out of the neural data, and it claims that there should be a relationship between those two. If you get the exact structure of neural data, you should be able to derive that. And again, mathematically, this could be something like an isomorphism, or many of these other mappings that mathematicians are studying, but it is calculable, it is computable. So that is where I see this headed and why I'm quite excited about. Computing phi to get the level of consciousness might just be a stepping stone for us to reach this holy grail to what I said at the very beginning, that what seemed to us mysterious, where we have neural activity and magically that turns into consciousness, we're replacing that magic with math. That's it. Thank you very much, everybody.